There is a loneliness that does not come from the lack of company, but the abundance of thought. An inner glow that grows as consciousness expands. What to do when you see the world clearly, that others do not see or cannot bear to see. Broadcaster wrote that to be aware is to be poisoned. As always, when too sharp, cuts ties with the simplicity of life. For some it's a privilege, for others, a curse. What happens when the mind becomes too big to fit in the world? History is not kind to those who think too much. Hamlet hesitated to the hearing. Night looked so much into the abyss that the abyss looked back. Pascal said that all man's problems come from your inability to stay quiet alone. In one quarter, they would all be condemned by their own lucidity. Science seems to confirm this discomfort. Studies show that people with whom I tend to socialize less and care more. They don't need company that much, or maybe realize too soon the superficiality of the interactions. As always, instead of approaching isolate, more because this video does not bring easy answers, because they pray never gave them. Here we delve into an essential human. Will extreme lighting lead inevitably loneliness? Or will it just be a side effect of those who see the world without illusions? Lucidity comes at a price. The question is, it is worth paying for it. There is an intelligence that only lucidity knows. A seizure that does not come from the body, but of thought. Who sees too much, feel too much, who feels too much, carries a burden that others do not even notice. Emil Cioran, the philosopher of disenchantment, knew it better than anyone else. The more we think, the further we get from life, wrote. But what does this gap mean? For theorists, thinking was a chronic disease. In mind, when too free, is not satisfied with simple answers. She digs every certainty, reduce every idea to dust. And when there is nothing left but dust, what's left to hold on to? Existence becomes a grotesque theater, where every human gesture carries a tragic weight to eat. Sleep, love. All this can seem banal for those who already understood too much. This is the tragedy of those who think beyond what is necessary. Living requires a degree of blindness. The child plays because he doesn't calculate death. The passionate surrenders because it ignores the transience of desire. But the hyper cannot resist, cannot surrender. He sees the invisible threads that sustain the spectacle of life, and when seeing them, loses the ability to believe in charm. If Cioran called it the horror of being lucid, is not a metaphor. He really saw Australia as a nightmare. If only we had the guts to go crazy. He wrote, because the cloud at least, it would be a relief. No, for nothing, history is full of jinn that were lost in thought itself. Night broke with the reality. Van Gogh cut his own flesh. Pascal with the emptiness of existence, shivered at the thought of the eternal silence of the universe. And then, we return to the question, lighting leads to, not by choice, but by gravity. The more one mind expands, the hardest part is finding company to match. The cruel irony is that this expansion does not bring happiness, just distance. But there is a second problem, even more cruel. The more the person isolates themselves, but think, and the more you think, but isolates itself, a cycle that closes in on itself. For Mistress, the mistake was not in the world, but in the very act of thinking. To have one more idea than necessary is already a tragedy, said. If this is true, so the real problem of smart people, it's not, is the fact that, even alone, their minds keep talking and never stop. Lighting is a slow-acting generator. At the beginning, looks like a gift. A sharp mind, able to understand what others do not understand, to see patterns where no one sees anything. But with time, the curse reveals itself. Because understanding too much is an invitation to. Science confirms what Cioran felt on the skin. Psychological studies show that people with high Q relate differently to the world. The evolutionary psychologist Satoshi Kanazawa discovered something surprising. The smarter an individual, less he feels the need for frequent social interactions. The so-called theory suggests that our mind still carries traces of primitive life, where small groups and constant relationships were essential for survival. But the cell acts like a mutation, allowing certain individuals escape this atavistic need. They don't need the group so much, manage to survive alone. But surviving is not the same as living. Cioran would say that this social independence, it is a cruel illusion. The joint can anesthetize the pathet's need for company. More does not eliminate the suffering that comes with her absence. He wrote, "The worst torment is not being misunderstood, but having no one to be misunderstood with. The problem isn't just being alone, but being alone within one's mind." The loneliness of the intelligent is not physical, is existential, and there is another side effect: emotional hyperness. Research indicates that highly intelligent individuals are often more prone to deep introspection, which can amplify feelings of sadness, anxiety, and boredom. Psychologist Adam Grant calls it the curse of excessive thinking. The brilliant mind doesn't just analyze everything, but also analyzes every word spoken, every gesture received, every decision made. Everything becomes an endless network of possibilities and regrets. Dostoevsky perfectly captured this anguish. In Crime and Punishment, Resconiv, the protagonist isolates himself not because he wants to, but because your mind doesn't allow any other option. He drowns in analysis itself, deconstructing each act, every thought, until the reality around you loses meaning. Excess thinking distance from others, also from himself. If they see this fate as inevitable, a mind that expands does not return to its original size. The problem of lucidity is not just seeing too much, but can no longer deviate. The lucid man is the one who does not let himself be deceived for nothing, not even for happiness. And here's the paradox. Extreme thickness can lead to isolation, but in turn amplifies the thought. A closed cycle, no escape. The question then changes. Is it that is really the choice of the intelligent? Or is it simply the consequence of a world that wasn't made to bear so much conscience? Thinking too much is like holding a sharp blade, unable to release it. At first, the mind seems like a powerful instrument, a control tool. But the more the cell turns to itself, but it becomes a torture mechanism. Excessive thinking does not light up, it burns. If Cioran knew this better than anyone else, for him thought was a disease. Not a luxury, no gift, but an unbearable burden. The mind is a tingle of doubts that never runs out. Lighting's problem isn't just seeing too much, but can't stop seeing. It's a continuous flow, a flood of consciousness that cannot be interrupted. Modern neuroscience suggests that Cioran was right. Studies show that people with high education are more likely to anxiety, depression, and obsessive disorders. Compulsive thinking is not a sign of genius, but exhaustion. The rumination, the act of repeating the same thoughts over and over again, is one of the greatest predictors of mental distress. The brain does not rest. He chews his own thought until nothing else but anguish. Night was one of the great examples of this intellectual imprisonment. He lived for his ideas until his ideas devoured him. Your radical thinking, sharp as a razor, became more and more unbearable until your mind one day broke. Thought is the great disgrace of the human species, said Cioran. But why? Why think too paralyzed? The linguistic analysis destroys spontaneity, gnaws the desire, weakens the will to act. Hamlet, consumed by doubts, is the perfect picture of it. To be or not to be? This question was not a philosophical, but a paralyzing poison. He did not live. I just hesitated. Your mind was one trap, and that hamster would have been less smart. And if I had felt more and thought less? That's the big question. Thought should be a tool. But for Thele aware, he becomes a prison. As you wrote, praying, excess lucidity transforms a human being in a spectator of ruin itself. But there is a final provocation. What if the problem isn't the root itself, but the use we make of it? The mind can be an instrument of analysis or a self-destruct mechanism. Which of the two does she become? It depends on what we do with what we know. Loneliness is a tragedy for those who suffer it, and a privilege for those who dominate it. Who can't stand their own company is doomed to get lost in others. But who learns to find shelter within himself need no refuge. Cioran said that loneliness is not a circumstance, but a destination. The lucid man is only saved if he accepts his isolation as a need. There is, therefore, two lonelinesses, tax and taxation. The first is an exile, the second a refuge. The question is, when madness brings someone to, this is a burden or a release. Arthur Schopenhauer, another great pessimist, saw as the mark of greatness. For him, a man's happiness depended of the quality of your thoughts, not the number of your companies, is the lot of all exceptional spirits. Wrote. His argument was simple, the precise mediocrity of the crowd. But genius flourishes in the distance. Nietzsche reinforced this idea by saying that what you do for the love of is what is worth in life. And, however, both philosophers ended their lives in devastating isolation. The problem with temporary is that, once hugged, it rarely allows return. Intellectual independence has a cost, the impossibility of belonging. Here comes an intriguing paradox. As always, by pushing someone away from others can make room for genuine freedom. Mistress noted that loneliness is an absolute for those who can no longer accept the world, who cannot believe in social illusions, in the rituals of coexistence, in the dance of the rocks, ends up preferring the company of thought itself. But this choice comes at a price. Become a stranger to others and, often, for yourself. The most radical example of this logic can be found in fiction. Dr. Manrattan of Watchmen represents uncertainty taken to the extreme. As your mind expands, your connection to humanity dissolves. He no longer feels like others, no longer wants like others, no longer suffers like others. Loneliness is not a punishment for him, but an inevitable consequence of his lucidity about the universe. But the question remains, there is a middle ground, or is the inevitable destiny of those who see too much for mistress? The answer was already given. There are moments in that the of a spirit resembles a crime. The problem is, time one chooses the path of mental independence. Any return to the world seems like a surrender. If lucidity is a sentence of isolation, there is a path that does not lead to, or any high width, is condemned to an emotional exile. If Cioran had no hope, For him, there is no medicine for conscience. Once you see the gear behind the human spectacle, it is impossible to be dazzled again, cannot be reconstructed. The world loses the magic. The gestures make predictable. Life itself seems rehearsed. For many, this is the insulation cell. There is no poison itself, but what does she destroy? The pleasure of illusion. But history suggests that there are ways out. Dostoevsky, perhaps the most tormented of writers, found art an antidote to his own lucidity. He wrote the Karamazov Brothers, like a cry against unihilism, a reconstruction effort. Tolstoy, after a lifetime of disappointment, embraced faith as a refuge against the weight of excessive thinking. Knight himself, before its fall, tried to create a philosophy that affirmed life, instead of denying and there is science. One of the most rigorous studies on happiness, conducted by Harvard University over 80 years ago, showed one inescapable data. Human connections are the biggest factor in well-being. No money, nor genius, nor status overcome the impact of deep relationships. Even for the smartest, absolute is not a solution. It's a risk. But then, how to reconcile lucidity and belonging? How to avoid, may this cell turn into a prison? If Cioran seemed to give a clue, even without wanting to, all we have left is laugh at despair. Maybe the way is not to escape lucidity, but learn to carry it lighter. Use it to create, to question without suffocating, to observe without completely moving away. Lighting can lead to, but is not synonymous with abandonment. The secret, it might be in finding those who also see too much, who also feel too much, who understand without needing explanation. Total is not destiny, but a choice, and maybe in the end, true wisdom. Be in knowing when to accept the poison, and when allowing another voice to fill it. If you got this far, it's because this theme has touched you somehow. Maybe you've already felt it in your skin, the weight of excessive thinking. Maybe, have you ever experienced this peculiar? That doesn't come from the lack of people, but the lack of real connection. The world seems full, barulhento, but at the same time distant. Here on the channel, we talk about it in depth. Bluntly, we bring reflections that challenge, question and make you think. If it has value to you, consider supporting the channel. You can become a member and access exclusive content, or use the super tanks to directly help create new videos. But above all, just watching, to leave your comment and share. You already is part of this community that refuses to accept easy answers, because in the end, too much thinking can isolate. But when we find others who also see beyond the surface, we realize that we are not really alone.